Okinawa, early May 1945. As American forces struggled to break through the second Shuri defensive ring, deep beneath the ancient stones of Shuri Castle, the commanders of Japan's 32nd Army gather on the night of May 2nd. In the flickering light of their underground headquarters, they make a fateful decision in one last attempt to turn the tide of the battle, a gamble that will cost them dearly. For over a month, the Japanese had waged a grinding war of attrition, slowing the advance of the U.S. 10th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., to a crawl, making the Americans pay dearly for every foot of ground gained. Yet even as their stubborn defense frustrated the invaders, this kind of warfare was not what many Japanese officers preferred. Tired of waiting to be burned alive in caves and tunnels, they grew impatient with defensive fighting. Seeing no hope of victory in a battle of attrition, the idea of an all-out counteroffensive and the chance to die a heroic death in the open field became increasingly appealing. Thus, unlike the feeble counterattack of April 12th, which had faced strong opposition and represented a compromise between rival factions within the 32nd Army headquarters, this time resistance to the plan was virtually non-existent, as all the division and brigade commanders were in favor of the attack. Even General Mitsuru Ushijima, the 32nd Army's commander, who had long advocated a prolonged defense designed to inflict the heaviest possible losses on the Americans, now gave his approval, and an all-out offensive was ordered for the dawn of May 4th. The final plan was nothing short of ambitious, calling for nothing less than the destruction of Major General John R. Hodges' 24th Corps, which spearheaded the American drive in southern Okinawa, as well as the neutralization of the Allied fleet offshore in a series of heavy coordinated blows by committing a sizable portion of Japan's air and ground forces along the entire front. The main effort of the ground attack was to be carried out by Lieutenant General Tatsumi Amamiya's 24th Division, a relatively intact unit that was to spearhead the drive through the center and eastern flank of the American lines. After breaking through the 24th Corps front line, the remaining forces, supported by other Japanese units, including the 27th Tank Regiment, were to pour through the gaps and systematically destroy American positions on and behind the front in a series of day and night attacks. Meanwhile, the fresh 44th Independent Mixed Brigade, under Major General Shigeru Suzuki, was to advance abreast of the 24th Division through the center, then turn west to isolate and annihilate the 1st Marine Division, supported from the south by elements of Lieutenant General Takeo Fujioka's decimated 62nd Division, the only major Japanese unit not committed to the attack. Even 10,000 men of Rear Admiral Minoru Ota's Okinawa Naval Base force were ordered to reorganize into infantry battalions, held as an exploitation reserve to be committed only on the 32nd Army's orders. Perhaps the most ambitious element of the plan was the amphibious attack. To carry it out, the Japanese assigned several hundred men from the 26th Shipping Engineer Regiment to launch night raids by barge, small boats, and native canoes, landing on the western beaches behind American lines. Armed only with light weapons and satchel charges, their mission was to infiltrate the rear areas and destroy tanks, artillery, and supply depots. On the opposite coast, men of the 23rd Shipping Engineer Regiment and 27th Sea Raiding Squadron were given a similar task against American positions east of the Shuri Line. The suicidal nature of the operation was underlined by the fact that the raiders were formally detached from their units and ordered not to return. Although the amphibious raids were essentially one-way missions, the May offensive was not intended to be a senseless banzai charge. On the contrary, the plan was highly detailed, with every unit assigned a specific role. Even medical, engineering, and logistical elements received precise daily tasks, routes of advance, and pre-planned supply points to sustain the push. Crucially, artillery was ordered out of its concealed firing positions on the night before the attack and placed in open field where crews could use maximum elevation and traverse, a deliberate trade-off of exposure for firepower and flexibility. Once infantry broke through the line, the guns were to be shifted forward to exploit any gap and batter American positions from close range. In parallel, Japan's remaining air and naval suicide units were to strike the U.S. fleet offshore. Kamikaze aircraft and suicide boats would attempt to sever American naval fire support and resupply as the ground assault unfolded. By the evening of May 3rd, everything was in position. Final orders reportedly read, "Each soldier will kill at least one American devil." Soon after sundown on May 3rd, Japanese artillery opened a fierce barrage, and as the night wore on, the shelling intensified, with over 7,600 rounds fired in the preparatory bombardment and another 8,600 hurled throughout the following day, most of them falling on the forward positions of the U.S. 7th and 77th Infantry Divisions. At the same time, in the pitch darkness, small groups of Japanese infantry, composed mostly of 3 or 4 men, crept forward toward the American lines to prepare attacks on command posts, heavy weapons and communications, while the tanks of the 27th Tank Regiment rumbled north along the main road. While the guns hammered at the American positions, the long-planned amphibious assault was set in motion. On the beaches south of Naha and Yonabaru, men of the shipping engineer regiments crowded into barges and small assault boats. Under a low, overcast sky, several hundred men of the 26th Shipping Engineer Regiment began their journey north, but navigation in the dark proved disastrous. The flotilla soon misjudged its course and turned toward shore near Makinato Airfield, one of the most heavily defended stretches of coast. Around 2 a.m., riflemen of the 1st Marine Division spotted the approaching boats and opened fire. Naval flares lit up the sea as mortars and machine guns joined in. In less than an hour, 10 barges were reduced to burning wrecks. Hundreds of Japanese were killed before reaching the beach. The Marines fired over 1,000 mortar rounds, spent dozens of ammunition boxes, and even burned out 6 machine gun barrels. If the Japanese planners' goal had been to force the Americans to expend ammunition and burn out machine gun barrels, the operation was a stunning success, though there were certainly less costly ways to achieve it. Yet despite murderous fire, a few scattered groups managed to reach the shore near Kuwan, only to be cornered and wiped out by morning. On the opposite coast, the results were no less disastrous. The Eastern Force, men of the 23rd Shipping Engineer Unit, rode north under cover of night, only to be intercepted by U.S. ships patrolling in Buckner Bay. Those who escaped destruction at sea were met by the guns of the U.S. 7th Division on shore. By dawn, the entire amphibious effort had collapsed in disaster. Between 500 and 800 men were lost, along with nearly all of their landing craft, without inflicting almost any damage on the Americans. At 2 a.m., the main attack began as waves of assault troops from the Japanese 24th Division advanced through their own artillery fire, with the main thrust driving along the road between the eastern end of the Uraso-Mura escarpment and the village of Kochi. In the sector held by the U.S. 7th Division, the initial assault caused some confusion and sporadic close-quarters skirmishes. But with the first light of dawn, the Americans, positioned on higher ground around Kochi and Onaga, could hardly believe their luck as they observed hundreds of Japanese soldiers advancing across open fields. The opportunity was too good to miss. Instead of the grueling inch-by-inch struggle of flushing caves with grenades and flamethrowers, the Japanese now marched straight into the open. It was the kind of target they had not seen since their landing on Okinawa, and the artillerymen and machine gunners could finally earn their keep. Hundreds of Japanese fell to shell, mortar, and machine gun fire, or as one platoon sergeant from the 7th Division reported, "We laid them down like ducks." By noon, the attack had disintegrated, and the American frontline troops mopped up the scattered and demoralized elements of the 89th Japanese Infantry Regiment that had reached their positions. Further west, the heaviest weight of the Japanese counterattack slammed into the 306th Infantry Regiment of the 77th Division, which held the boundary line with the 7th Division. Here, in this crucial sector, the main road running south wound around the eastern base of the Uraso-Mura escarpment. Through this narrow corridor, the Japanese 32nd and elements of the 22nd Regiments of the 24th Division, backed by tanks from the 27th Tank Regiment, were ordered to break through and open the way for the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade to strike west and isolate the 1st Marine Division. For the men of the 306th, the timing could hardly have been worse. In the days before the attack, the regiment had been stretched thin, handling multiple tasks. Its 3rd Battalion was pushing south along the road while trying to maintain contact with the 7th Division on the left flank. Meanwhile, elements of the 1st Battalion were committed to supporting the 307th Regiment in the savage fight for Hacksaw Ridge. Before dawn on May 4th, the 32nd Regiment launched its attack, supported only by a handful of light tanks, as the rest of the 27th Tank Regiment had been delayed by constant American artillery fire pounding the roads behind the front. The attack quickly lost momentum, and by 7:30 a.m., the 306th Regiment had driven off the Japanese in a disorganized withdrawal. Those who tried to retreat did so across open ground, swept by artillery and mortar fire, and few made it back alive. And yet, amidst all this chaos, a fleeting glimmer of success emerged. While the 32nd Regiment was being cut down, the 1st Battalion of the 22nd Regiment managed to slip through the gap between the 77th and 7th Divisions near Kochi, pushing more than a kilometer into the American lines before withdrawing at dusk. This brief, almost accidental gain was enough to convince General Amamiya that he had found a weak spot in the American defenses. Determined to exploit the opportunity, he ordered the attack to be renewed that night, despite the day's debacle. At 2 a.m., the 1st Battalion of the 32nd Regiment moved forward again, supported by tanks pushing through artillery and mortar fire to clash with the 306th Regiment in brutal close-quarters combat. The fighting raged until dawn, when the Americans finally re-established their lines and drove the attackers back. However, amid the noise and confusion, roughly 450 Japanese soldiers managed to infiltrate through a gap in the 24th Corps' line, advancing as far as the village of Tanabaru and the escarpment to the northeast of the village, where they were joined by other scattered infiltrating groups that had slipped through the lines the previous day, and together they reoccupied positions they had abandoned less than 2 weeks earlier, on the night of April 23rd. This penetration had done more than just reclaim lost ground. The infiltrating Japanese troops had also cut the only supply road used by the 17th Infantry Regiment of the 7th Division. To deal with the threat in his rear, Colonel Francis Packler, commanding officer of the 17th Regiment, ordered Companies E and F of the 2nd Battalion to move in and clear the area. What followed was 3 days of bitter close-quarters fighting as the Americans fought their way to retake Tanabaru and the high ground on which it stood. When the last pockets of resistance were finally crushed, 462 Japanese lay dead, most of them on the ridge, others cut down as they tried to slip back toward their own lines. By the night of May 5th, General Ushijima could no longer deny what had become obvious. The grand offensive had failed. Realizing that further attacks would only waste lives, he reverted to defensive warfare once again. At midnight, he issued a new order stating, "The battle plan in the Shuri area sector will be the attrition of enemy strength until he has lost his endurance." The scale of the failure was staggering. 24th Corps counted 6,227 Japanese dead, nearly all of them irreplaceable veteran infantrymen, and not a single meaningful gain to show for it. In addition to the 24th Division, which had been heavily hit, the 27th Tank Regiment had been virtually wiped out. Out of its original 54 light and medium tanks, only 6 medium tanks remained operational, and these were soon buried in the earth to serve as stationary artillery and improvised pillboxes northwest of Shuri. Moreover, to make matters worse, American counter-battery fire, directed with the help of aerial observers despite the overcast skies, had destroyed 59 artillery pieces caught in the open. The only silver lining was that the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade, having not been committed to the attack once the 24th Division's advance stalled, remained largely intact. American casualties were also heavy, even by the brutal standards of the fighting on Okinawa. The sheer cost of the battle is best illustrated by the fact that on May 4th, the 1st Marine Division, which had not even faced the main Japanese counterattack, lost 352 men in its push west and southwest of Makinato Airfield, a higher toll than the combined 335 casualties suffered that day by the 7th and 77th Infantry Divisions, which had borne the brunt of the Japanese assault. The following day, those two army divisions recorded another 379 losses, a toll comparable to the bloodiest days of the earlier fighting around Kochi Ridge and during the first days of the general offensive of April 19th. Yet, despite the heavy punishment inflicted on the Japanese, the Americans could not immediately exploit their success. Ushijima still retained a sizable reserve, a mixture of service troops and rear echelon personnel hastily folded into depleted frontline regiments. In the defense, these improvised formations would prove nearly as stubborn as the veteran infantry they replaced. When the smoke finally cleared, the front lines were almost exactly where they had been before the attack. Only the landscape had changed, now littered with craters and the wreckage of machines. And while the battle on land ground on along its familiar course, off the coast of Okinawa, the sea boiled. In support of the ground offensive, the Japanese High Command unleashed the full strength of its air arm. Beginning late on May 3rd, hundreds of aircraft took off from airfields in Kyushu and Formosa to hurl themselves against the Allied fleet in what became a furious two-day onslaught. Around 6 p.m., the first wave of about 50 planes, a mix of kamikazes and conventional bombers, emerged from the clouds and plunged toward the ships below. For more than 2 hours, Marine and Navy pilots, together with anti-aircraft gunners afloat and ashore, fought off the determined assault, downing 36 planes. Yet, as always, a few broke through. Within an hour, 5 kamikazes slammed into the destroyer mine layer USS Aaron Ward, setting her ablaze and killing or wounding 98 men before she finally slipped beneath the waves. Just 2 minutes later, 4 more kamikazes struck the destroyer USS Little, sending her to the bottom as well, with 31 killed and 79 wounded. In the same furious assault, 1 landing ship was sunk, while another was damaged along with 2 mine layers. For the sailors off Okinawa, however, scenes like this were nothing new, merely part of the grim routine. Except for brief spells when bad weather grounded the Japanese planes, air raids came almost daily. By the end of April, the U.S. Navy had already counted 1,853 men killed or missing and another 2,650 wounded, and the struggle for Okinawa was still far from over. With the dawn of May 4th, the skies over Okinawa came alive once again. The kamikazes returned in force, timing their strikes to coincide with the opening phase of the 32nd Army's counterattack on land. More than 200 aircraft swept down toward the ships of the U.S. Fifth Fleet in the first raid of the day. The battle raged for more than 2 hours, during which the destroyers USS Morrison and USS Luce were both hit and sent to the bottom of the East China Sea, along with 2 landing craft, while the light cruiser USS Birmingham, 2 additional destroyers, a minesweeper, and several smaller vessels were left burning or badly damaged, but still afloat. Later in the evening, the attacks flared once more. A group of twin-engine bombers approached the anchorage off Karama Reto, and one crashed squarely onto the flight deck of the escort carrier USS Sangamon, triggering a massive explosion that set her ablaze. Only extraordinary damage control efforts kept her afloat. 36 men were killed, and though USS Sangamon survived, she never returned to service. The day was costly, not only for the Americans. Far to the southwest, Vice Admiral Sir Bernard Rawlings's British Pacific Fleet, conducting strikes against the Sakishima Islands at the southern tip of the Ryukyus, nearly 280 kilometers from Okinawa, came under attack as well. At 11:31 a.m., a lone undetected Zero fighter slipped through the clouds and dove straight onto the flight deck of the carrier HMS Formidable. The explosion caused extensive damage, killing 9 and wounding 47. Yet unlike their American counterparts, the British carriers had armored decks, a design choice that prevented heavier damage. By nightfall, the fires had been extinguished and the ship was back in operation. With a total of 589 Allied sailors killed, May 3rd and 4th marked the deadliest 2-day period of the Okinawa campaign. Concerned by the mounting naval losses, Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, and Vice Admiral Richmond Turner, commander of the Pacific Fleet's amphibious forces, grew increasingly anxious about the slow pace of progress ashore. Both began pressing Buckner, commander of the 10th Army on Okinawa, to bring the battle to a faster conclusion. As April turned to May, a worried Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander-in-chief of the United States Pacific Fleet, personally visited Okinawa to assess the situation. When Buckner reminded him that the land battle fell under Army authority, Nimitz curtly replied, "Yes, but ground though it may be, I'm losing a ship and a half a day. So if this line isn't moving within 5 days, we'll get someone here who can move it, so we can all get out from under these stupid air attacks." The message was clear. Within the complex command structure of Operation Iceberg, the 10th Army, though an army formation, operated under the Navy's direct control, or precisely under Vice Admiral Turner's Task Force 56. Now under growing pressure from his superiors, General Buckner issued orders on May 6 for a new general offensive against the Shuri defenses to begin on May 11th. In the meantime, he directed his division commanders to keep pressing the Japanese positions and seize as much ground as possible before the main assault began. The following day, on May 7th, in preparation for a coordinated assault, and with the arrival of the 6th Marine Division in southern Okinawa, Major General Roy S. Geiger was ordered to resume command of the 1st Marine Division, which had been temporarily attached to 24th Corps since late April, and return it to the control of the 3rd Amphibious Corps. Along with the division, marine artillery units that had been supporting the 24th Corps' advance since early April were also returned to Marine Command. With this reorganization, the 3rd Amphibious Corps now held responsibility for the entire western flank, where the 6th Marine Division was to take up new positions along the coast. At the same time, General Buckner assumed direct tactical control over both corps for the coming offensive, and the final plan called for the 10th Army to renew its drive against the Shuri defenses with its 2 corps fighting abreast, the 3rd Amphibious Corps on the right and the 24th Corps on the left. In the meantime, the American advance continued to inch southward. On the right flank of the 24th Corps, the 1st Marine Division turned east on May 6th to seize the high ground overlooking the Asa River. Progress was painfully slow, roughly 1 hill per day, or barely 300 meters on average, and every gain came at a steep cost. The fighting was so close that rifles often gave way to bayonets and knives, while hand grenades were used up so quickly that it was sometimes impossible to keep enough grenades on the line. The stubborn defense put up by elements of the Japanese 62nd Division made every meter of advance count in Marine lives. Then, as if to add insult to exhaustion, heavy rains on May 7th further slowed down the already slow progress. On the morning of May 8th, word of Germany's surrender finally reached the men on Okinawa. Across the units of the 10th Army, the announcement of victory in Europe drew little more than weary shrugs. For the rain-soaked men, crouched in their muddy foxholes, surrounded by death and exhaustion, the war was far from over. Their fate lay not in distant Europe, but in the Japanese positions just meters away. That same day, the first elements of the 6th Marine Division began to move into the front lines. Along the northern bluffs of the Asa River estuary on the west coast, the 22nd Marines relieved the 1st Marines of the 1st Marine Division. At daybreak on May 9th, the 22nd Marines launched their first offensive action, sending patrols across the riverbank in search of a suitable crossing site and a foothold that could be expanded into a bridgehead for the coming general attack. The arrival of the 22nd Marines allowed the 1st Marine Division to regroup and redeploy for the next phase of the operation. The 7th and 1st Marines shifted across the division front to take up positions for the May 11th offensive, while the 5th Marines were assigned a narrower sector on the division's left, supporting the 77th Infantry Division in clearing out isolated pockets of Japanese resistance in the tangled gorges of the so-called Awacha Pocket, which still clung stubbornly to ground behind the front. In the meantime, the 7th and 77th Divisions sought to exploit the disarray within the Japanese 24th Division. On May 6th, both divisions dispatched strong patrols into the area of the recent counterattack to eliminate stragglers and search for weak points along the Japanese line. At the center of the 10th Army's front, the 77th Division resumed its advance on May 7th after completing the mop-up operations on Kochi Ridge. With the 307th and 306th Infantry Regiments attacking abreast, the division advanced roughly 500 meters during the day against increasingly stubborn resistance. Even with new tactics, using concentrated fire from heavy weapons to soften up a small sector, then sending in assault teams to clear isolated strongpoints before extending a narrow salient to support the next push, progress remained painfully slow. That same day, the division's 3rd Regiment, the 305th, without its 2nd Battalion, which was still on occupation duty in the Kurama Islands, rejoined the division after being relieved on Ieshima by the 27th Division. It moved into line to replace the battle-worn 307th Regiment, which had borne the brunt of the fighting for Kochi Ridge. Working alongside the 5th Marines, the 305th helped encircle and eliminate the Japanese resistance in the Awacha Pocket, which was finally secured on May 11th. By May 10th, the 77th Division had steadily improved its jump-off positions, seizing high ground that offered a clear view of its next and most critical objective of the upcoming offensive, the city of Shuri. Farther east, after a day of extensive patrolling on May 6th, the 7th Division resumed its slow southward drive with 2 regiments abreast. Following a brief pause caused by the failed Japanese counteroffensive, the bitter struggle for Kochi Ridge, which had begun on April 26th, was renewed on May 7th. Yet the results remained unchanged. The 17th Regiment once again found itself locked in an infantryman's battle, where progress was measured less in meters gained than in Japanese dead. Meanwhile, on the division's left, the 184th Regiment pushed forward across the low ground toward the western approaches of Conical Hill, gaining little in the face of determined resistance from well-entrenched defenders on the hills overlooking the coastal flats. By this time, the lack of progress had drawn sharp pressure from General Hodge for the 7th Division to push more aggressively. Although the 96th Infantry Division, freshly rested and reinforced with about 4,000 replacements, was moving into rear assembly areas to relieve the 7th, neither the 17th nor the 184th Regiment waited passively for relief. On May 8th, they launched a well-coordinated assault, but the attack faltered under the crushing weight of Japanese artillery and mortar fire, leaving the stalemate along Okinawa's east coast unbroken. Relief finally came on May 9th, when the battle-weary 17th Regiment was replaced by the 382nd Regiment of the 96th Division. The following day, the 383rd Regiment moved up to take over the 184th sector north of Conical Hill. The fresh units quickly set to work, reducing enemy strongpoints that had resisted for weeks and securing most of Kochi Ridge, along with the surrounding heights that guarded the approaches to Conical Hill, valuable ground that would serve as the springboard for the forthcoming May 11th offensive. By May 10th, American forces were still short of the line designated by the 10th Army as the starting point for the next general offensive. Yet there was no time to delay. The front had solidified, the men were exhausted, and the Japanese remained deeply entrenched. The order to advance could not wait. As the battle dragged on, the lines had barely moved, but the 32nd Army's fate on Okinawa was already sealed. The stage was now set for the final, all-out drive against the Shuri defenses.